Hi, Dom.
Hey, Jenna.
Hey. Um, so we said last week that we were gonna discuss the issue of vice, and I guess what I wanted to kind of go back to was how you initially heard, because I know how I heard, and it was because you texted me.
Yeah, so I got an alert from Variety on my phone, and I was like, what the hell is this? And I saw it and I was like, wow. It just it blew me away. And the first person I reached out to was you. I was like, I gotta let Jenna know about this.
And the weird part was that I was driving, and I have like the voice text system or whatever in my phone. Um, but for this, this was beyond texting. Like, I had to immediately call you and discuss. And I thought, actually, I didn't know what I thought, but I just knew that like this was beyond texting for me. And I slowly came to realize that there was more happening within me about this story that did and did not have to do with Vice. So that's why we decided to um, dedicate this show to all of those feelings that came up when we heard the news. So, Dom, you ready to start the show?
Let's do it.
All right. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So, where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. Yeah, so Dom, what was officially the news that broke?
Well, so again, this was from Variety from last Thursday, February 22nd, and the headline was Vice will cease publishing on vice.com and lay off several hundred staffers. So right now I believe as at that time, it were a little over 900 staffers who worked at Vice. So several hundred of those staffers will be laid off. Um, and it's just startling. I mean, this was a company that was worth just, a few years ago when it was at its heyday was worth $5.7 billion and
Billion.
billion and was what everyone was talking about, especially within the journalism news field. And now it's, you know, slowly just disappearing. And it's sad to hear. I mean, I know that there's still a presence, they're doing it, but still, it's just the fact that most of the people who are there will be gone. Um, Shocking.
Well, I think it was I mean, first of all, it was the shock that Vice, which uh I had really come to respect as especially an investigative unit. Um, but also there was something about several hundred
Hmm.
employees were going to lose their job. And yet the headline, the article from Variety was written in a way where it's like, well, that wasn't exactly clear which of people would be that several hundred, which to me, it gave me this feeling almost like, okay, I'm going to engage in hyperbole here, but that there's almost like a guillotine blade just swinging. It's coming for somebody's head. Could be yours. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's your neighbor. Maybe it's not. That's just like, a- and it
Yeah.
took me a while to realize that part of why that was so unnerving for me was it brought up my own layoff trauma and how, we were given a message the night before we officially were told, and how that was just, a sleepless night. How, like, you know, you knew, but you didn't know, but like, oh my God. And I immediately very deeply felt for everybody within that organization. Almost, yeah, there's no other way to put it except to say that I relived the experience all over again. It was incredibly vicariously traumatic again.
Yeah, I mean, I actually listened to they have a podcast called Cyber,
Hmm.
and I listened to they had 5 journalists on there who from the organization who were, number 1, surprised. They were like, "Let's see if this actually can go online, if this actually will go through, or if they've already shut this part down, or if they won't allow us to go on." And, um, they recorded it, and it was like an hour of them talking about the situation over there and how just I think obviously people knew where this was headed, because they've been having financial issues for a while, but I think it was the way for them, how they were talking about it was, how it was handled, by
Hmm.
management. And, I think they looked at it as some of them were already prepared to get a job. Some was like, listen, I'm going on vacation. I might get laid off while I'm on vacation. So, I guess I'll see. And they sounded positive, which I think a lot of us are certain situations, like you're in such a state of shock. You're just like,
I was
you know,
totally positive initially.
so you kind of go through this phase of like, I don't know what it's a state of shock.
Yeah, it's
But
total state of shock.
so feel for these journalists and what they are going through, and obviously this touched something, I think, because a lot of us saw Vice as being this. I mean, the investigative journalism, I was telling you just before we started this, how they won a number of news Emmys just in 2023 for, in terms of, uh, they did talk about fentanyl, and they also there was something they won for, um, the Putin's war in Ukraine. Teenagers discuss abortion, like
Hmm.
they did such hard hitting news. And I think, especially back in the day when they were just getting started, they had a very current feel, irreverent. They also did, as we also discussed, had some really funny, attention grabbing headlines,
Yeah.
which I share with you.
Irreverent is the, the word I
Yes,
would use.
last night went on one of these searches on YouTube, and I found a video of Adam Lambert singing some of the most outrageous Vice headlines. And I loved it. I loved it. And he was so funny because some of them were, um, I'm just gonna read some of these just because just
Sure,
so people get
these
a
were
sense.
headlines.
Sperm whales shit will make you rich. Why
I think I
climbing
read
Mount
that.
Everest gives people weird boners. Someone did a shit on a British Airways plane. It had to turn around and come back again. That's a bop, though. I got to tell you, he's saying that he said, "This is it. This is it."
I was gonna say the way he sang it, he did make it a bop, and I also do remember that story and being like, "Oh well, I'm definitely clicking on that." And I get that that's the purpose,
Yes.
um, but at the same time, what I at least thought from a distance was so genius was that by doing those kind of stories that of course people are gonna click on. My God, it would support the business in a way so that when they did the investigative stories like you said about like fentanyl addiction and things like that, that would support that because investigative work that I for people who might not know is not only unbelievably time consuming but it's incredibly expensive.
Hmm.
But it's so necessary and worth doing. So I I assumed, but I, was wrong. And then in all fairness, I mean, as this was unfolding, and I finally got home after I was in the car and I opened up Twitter, and of course, I'm seeing just tweet after tweet after tweet after tweet. Um, I'm also seeing this other story about an NPR member station in Washington, WAMU, that also was laying off like 15 people and shuttering their online publication, DCist. And just all of the fallout from that. And again, it just the feeling that I had from that overnight, just like it kept re-erupting over and over again. And I remember I feel like you spoke to me and you said something like, I hope you're able to get some rest. And initially in my, it's okay brain from, my experiences in a newsroom. I was, but it really wasn't until maybe Saturday that I was like, no, just having reread these headlines and having read all of these journalists sharing their trauma on Twitter, I was like, no, dude, I'm not okay. I
Mm-hmm.
can't keep reading about how this industry that I've dedicated my adult life to is just crumbling.
I, I we touched base the next day and well, even that night on Thursday night we talked about um trying to reach out to maybe someone from Vice who could come and talk about what had happened. And I remember the next day, and as time went on, we started realizing like we did reach out to a couple of people, and then we were like, oh, wait a minute, we might not hear back from them because they're dealing with shit right now.
Oh,
And
completely.
they're not in a and it's like, wait a minute, we were not in a headspace for a while. I couldn't even imagine why they did it together. Like the journalists I heard had a conversation, but with their fellow, just like we did with our own
Mhm.
fellow
Mhm.
coworkers, where people are talking amongst themselves. We're all experiencing the same thing. It's very different than talking about this outside, but I do think it shows you also for us, like how it's so difficult to get out of that mindset in terms of the
And
work that
that's
we do of
immediate. Yes,
journalism.
literally, like I downshifted into just like, you're absolutely right. That's what the story needs. We should turn it. And yeah, it took a couple of days to be like, wait a second. No, these people deserve the same space and grace
Mhm,
that I got.
mhm,
Where, I mean, and I had people who were just like, hey, I might know of a freelance gig 2 weeks after I heard before I even had the bandwidth to call anybody back. And they absolutely deserve that space and that grace if or as long as they need cuz it's rough.
and I think, for me, like, it took it like, I went out oh, sorry. I went out on Friday night, and I just felt out of it. I was with hanging out with my friends, having a beer, talking, and I could feel that I was out of it. I think just because I was in my head too, and it didn't happen to me, but we had already planned on having this discussion about trauma and journalism. And I felt like for me, that was something that just triggered something. And I know, it's something that triggered in me this feeling of like, oh, wow. Like you almost feel like you're going through it again, even though it's not applying to you. It just feels
100%.
like you're going right through it again. And that's when we were like, we have to do this as focus a show on this topic and not talk about any other. Listen, there are definitely other headlines that I think we just made a conscious decision to really focus on this and kind of look to trying to help others and even for ourselves to discuss the issue of trauma and how this impacts us and hopefully try to be even more so on that road of healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So now
Uh,
joining us, we have Samantha Ragland, Vice President of Journalism Programs at the American Press Institute. Hi, Sam.
Hi.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much for joining us.
Of course, I'm honored to be here.
I'm so touched. Well, we have a lot to talk about because, of course, the notion of trauma in journalism just covers so many different aspects. But for you, I guess, what would you say would be the headline issue around trauma as it relates to being a journalist?
I guess I would say that the headline issue is that unfortunately, I think news leaders assume that trauma impacts everyone exactly the same. That's actually not how trauma works. And so, in the way that my body and my mind and my spirit are impacted by trauma will be very different from yours, which will be very, very different from our managers, very, very different from our publisher, right? And until we can, I think, get on equal footing and respecting how the hazards of this work impact us all uniquely, it will be very, very difficult to get to the necessary newsroom of like the present and the future that is like holistic and healthy, both for the journalists within it, and then of course by proxy, the community external to it.
Okay, all right. But I think first off, the notion of a holistic newsroom is just a foreign concept of itself. So I want to back up a little bit and just start with just for the journalists themselves, because at
Yeah.
least one of the things that I found so enriching about this work is that even if you clash, even if you butt heads, there's still something very like-minded about the people who are drawn to this kind of work. So
Sure.
from your experience, is there like a certain personality type that we seem to fit?
I don't know if I would say that it's a personality type, but I do think that there are character traits that are natural inside the body and the mind of a journalist. I think that we are naturally resilient as a people group. We have a level of, I think, grit and determination to get the story, to speak the truth, in a way that almost feels unmatched in the way that we are doing service-based work, right? And so when I talk about journalists, especially with non-news people, I'm like, we're like an entire people group unto ourselves. And yes, we are a diverse people group within that. But when you are a journalist and you meet another journalist, there's like this like automatic connection because like you've seen some things and you've been through some things and you are bearing some of the wounds of that that other people, it's really, really hard, I think, for other people to understand that sometimes.
Interesting. Is there like, I guess, I don't want to say normal circumstances, but how would you describe that journalism as a, not just a career, but as a job, the job itself? How can that or does that inflict trauma, just doing the work?
Well, the job for most of us is a calling, which means that we hold ourselves, I think, to a higher level of accountability and responsibility to continue to do the work, which often means continuing to endure the trauma. This is as true for frontline reporters and journalists as it is for what I call backline journalists, the audience journalist, your engagement folks, your product thinkers. We typically assume that trauma, that there has to be a direct exposure in order for there to be impact on us, and it's just not true. I mean, that's just like it's science. Vicarious trauma is very real. Living through other people's traumatic experiences can have just as deep an impact on you as going through the experience yourself, which means, kind of going back to my first point, a trauma-aware newsroom needs to understand that we are all at risk for absorbing the trauma that is happening within our communities when we tell these stories, when we republish these stories, when we edit these stories, when we produce these stories, when we distribute these stories, right? Like, if you think that like doom scrolling on Twitter/X just came about because somebody was like doom scrolling, right? Like, no, vicarious trauma and secondary exposure are very real. And just the mere act of watching it go by has a biological, psychological, and emotional impact on us as people.
I would say so. I mean, Dom, has there been
Yeah.
any, I guess, experiences in your career where it's just been like, this is covering the story is impacting me personally? Because I know I've got my stories.
Yeah, and I think some of them, I have to say the 2016 election, 2020 elections, really covering that story every day. Um, and it is part of the news, but also what we were covering in those stories were so traumatic to many of us, in terms of seeing the divide within the people. That was like a day and day. It was exhausting,
Yeah.
covering it was day in, day out. It was the news was just a constant. And I remember just feeling just like after a while, and a lot of us did, and who worked on our team were, it was just like you felt like, how much more can I actually take? I mean, this is part of our job, but you just start feeling like, how much more can I take of this? Because it didn't, and I don't know what was so, I mean, obviously I have my ideas of what was so different, but it has felt like it's amplified over the past, 8 or more so years.
Sure.
Well, for
How about you,
me,
Jenna?
yeah, I was gonna say for me, I would say, I mean, definitely, one of the things that now that I'm out for the time being, which I'm trying to really embrace as a chance for some reflection and growth, is how much this job just requires, at least for me to be able to do it, compartmentalizing. There's been a lot of times when I was like a beat reporter or something, or even, hosting a news talk show where I had to put Jenna, the individual, on a shelf and just focus on the needs of the story. And I think definitely after 2016, as a Black woman working in media, that became a lot more difficult. And I really began to feel the weight of that. But particularly for stories, I mean, the one that sticks out in my mind the most about trauma was I was freelancing at the time and I was sent out to the day one of Sandy Hook. And of course, that was a horrific story to cover. But I was so focused on making sure that, I had the right sources. I had all the names right correctly. I had them spelled correctly, pronounced correctly. I had my sound. My sound was good. I was filing back to the station in a timely manner, getting them all the information that they need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I literally just did not process any of the grief I was bearing witness to until Uvalde happened. And then literally it just came erupting back at, like, I didn't even realize that was what was upsetting me so much when I was assigned to do a sit down conversation about the story, until I really had a chance to think about it, probably right after I had done one of the stories that I was doing. And I realized, oh my God, this is unprocessed Sandy Hook trauma. So I
Yeah.
guess from your work and perspective, is what we're describing, is that normal?
It's very normal and it's very real. I think one of the things that I'm hearing you all talk about and that I have experienced myself, the first is we all have a reservoir of resilience. Everybody has a different amount of that. It's called surge capacity. And surge capacity is an age-old term that typically, like cavemen, right, like needed their surge capacity. They would go out and they would forage, and then a bear would come, right, and they would surge through this near-death experience, and then they would go back to the cave with their berries and they would rest, right? Because without the rest, your resilience isn't refilled, which means that your ability to surge through inordinate amounts of like stress or despair doesn't happen. And so for a journalist, I think we naturally have this ability to surge for the story. We've all been in a breaking news situation where the entire newsroom understood what was at stake, which meant that you automatically go into 12-hour shifts. Everybody knows that their beat, they're writing off of their beat, covering different sources and different stories because the community required that of the local news source. We've all been there. That is our ability to surge, right? It's the resilience you don't know you have until you absolutely need it. That's the first thing that I'm hearing, which is why you didn't process the despair in the moment in time, right? You couldn't possibly have done that and done your job too.
No.
But what happened after Sandy Hook? For me, what happened after Parkland, right? Like what happened after Pulse? You didn't process after the fact, right? You probably didn't rest, first of all, because even like for Sandy Hook, for the 2016 election, the idea of a mental health day was totally still foreign to newsrooms, right? Like that was something that we have the pandemic to thank, right, for. And so we didn't take one of those naturally, right? Which means that we didn't even give our bodies and minds a chance to rest, not only to rest and then to kind of like process. That didn't happen. And so then being faced again with the trauma that you compartmentalized very much intentionally, it's natural for it to come to the surface and for you to figure out from there where you might need to go next, or your body and your mind are just done holding it. Like the body, we talked about this previously, but like the body keeps the score is a really, really fascinating, albeit traumatic read, though it
Hmm.
is very true. Anything that you see, anything that you report on, anything that you hear or feel is absorbed into your body without reconciling what happened, without the awareness of and the ability to navigate through that. It will just stay within your body and raise your blood pressure, impact your sleep and your ability to sleep. It'll raise your it'll like decrease your tolerance for like the BS. All of a sudden you've got no patience and you've got a high temper when you never had that before. All of this happens when we are absorbing the blows of the job, right? The impact of the trauma and the hazards of this work without then getting to the other side and saying, I think I need to talk about that. When you talk about that, and maybe you talk about it with a therapist, great. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you talk about it with your homeboy. And that is like actually the intentionality of choosing the person that you want to connect with to talk through a thing, even for just a couple of minutes, has been shown to do just as much healing and repair for the mind and the body as going to therapy, right? Like that's just neuroscience. It's quite the brain on trauma is really, really fascinating, and navigating through the trauma um, uh, hinges upon how intentional you choose to connect with somebody else.
Well, I'm
Sam,
wondering. Oh, Dom, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was going to ask Sam, what about as journalists, sometimes we don't think we have the right to feel these things. Sometimes I know for me in situations like I just realized I had to do a job
Yeah.
and I didn't give myself that grace of even thinking I had the right to complain about it. We
Sure.
report on these stories and sometimes you look at the story and you say, this is what these people are doing. They're going through a hardship. Like when you talk about
Yeah.
Parkland, or you talk about Pulse, you look at those situations and you look at, or 9/11, which I work through, and you look and you're like, I don't have a right to complain, but my
Right.
duty is to report the story. And I think sometimes as journalists we keep it deep inside and we say, I shouldn't be able to talk about this. How do we actually give ourselves that grace to do
I
that?
think it comes down to knowledge and learning. And quite frankly, I think one of the biggest mistakes that I made in my time in the newsroom was believing that we didn't have the right to feel the things that we were feeling. I actually remember after Pulse, somebody sent us therapy puppies, right? In the Palm Beach Post newsroom. And I went into the staff lounge, and there were these like amazing puppy golden retrievers in this cage, and everybody was like huddling, right? And I was like, I got a golden retriever and I was so happy. Now, mind you, I was like a digital person. So I wasn't the one sent. I was the one seeing, right? But I wasn't the one who was sent. And so I was cuddling with this therapy puppy along with some of the other digital team. And a reporter who was sent came in to the staff lounge, and she looked around, and then she caught my eye and she said to me, "What are you doing here? You didn't see what we saw. You don't have a right to be here now." And I, Dom, I put the puppy down and I left because I was like, she's totally right. And then fast forward to the pandemic, I'm no longer in the newsroom. I'm working at the Poynter Institute at the time. And I learned of something called the hierarchy of pain. I'm working with a trauma therapist, actually, a trauma therapist who was at Sandy Hook, Jenna, as a first responder to the needs of journalists, this incredible trauma therapist named Dr. Kevin Becker. And he taught me about this concept called the hierarchy of pain. And he said, listen, Sam, what you felt was real, but what somebody else thought you had a right to feel, that was the inaccuracy. So then we're going back to direct versus indirect exposure to trauma, and that both have severe implications on what you were able to offer mentally, physically, and socially in your life. And so the hierarchy of pain suggests that I've got greater access to the pain because I was directly a witness to it. And it's just not true. Like the studies have proven that it's just not true. If I were to go back into the newsroom today, one of the first things that I would need to do for my team is explain to them the hierarchy of pain. Explain to them that just because you aren't called out, just because you're on the features team, just because you're a video producer, doesn't mean that what you are seeing isn't having an impact. And when it is, you have to tell me about it. I cannot help you if I don't know, right? Um, it's a yeah, it's interesting when you look back at your career and you're like, dang, I made some mistakes. And when I learned that one several years after I needed it, Dom, I was devastated at what my team potentially stuffed down because they thought they didn't have it right.
It makes me emotional to hear you tell that story because I feel like when somebody's at that place where they're ready to actually go there, to dig in and say, listen, I'm feeling this. And then it's sort of you're shut out of it. And I think sometimes not just the hierarchy, but also managers can sort of also call you out on that because they're just like, the job's got to get done. We don't have time for this. And they will have you shut it out. And that's so damaging too. And it's like people just invalidating what you're feeling because they're just thinking, well, the job's got to get done. And it's like, but it isn't just a job. What we're doing, we're dealing with real life. So hearing you say that it makes me sad and angry.
Yeah. Well, and that's a psychological response too, right? Because what
Mhm.
I have found too in my work and having trained, thousands and thousands and thousands of journalists across the globe at this point, is that typically managers are the first to understand and be deeply impacted by the concept of psychological of the hierarchy of pain, because they also don't believe, right? It wasn't me, it was I had to send the reporter.
Mhm.
I can't possibly. One of the number one questions that I got in the duration of the pandemic was, how am I supposed to lead a traumatized staff when I'm traumatized? How am I supposed to help a burned out reporter when I'm burned out? This is the questions that managers, big newsrooms, small newsrooms, Spanish language newsrooms, English language newsrooms for BIPOC communities, new legacy newsrooms. The number one question that they're asking me is how, because now that they have the language and now that they understand, oh, this happened to me too, they're like, now what am I supposed, I got to unpack my own stuff now too, like on
Mhm.
top of everything else. Um, but that to me is the light bulb moment, right? That you can turn it on and you can choose to not see the work the same again. You can choose to acknowledge that it's a trauma-facing industry, that there are hazards of the job, and then help and coach your people as well as help and coach yourself through the work. Because again, when it's a calling, as for 98% of us, whatever, right? It probably is hard to turn your back on a calling when you are forced, right? To turn your back on the calling. Look at Jenna, you said this when we talked the other day. You're like, but I'm a journalist. I got to go
Yeah,
back,
no,
right?
that's very true.
Yep.
And as I'm listening to all of this, I mean, I'm trying so hard to fight my, I guess, my own traumatic cynicism. And that
Yeah.
is because my experience of newsrooms has traditionally been, regardless of who's leading them, something of a bit of a haggard old boys kind of club situation. Meaning, there is a news cycle that needs to be fed. And we've got to do whatever we have to do to make sure that we make our deadlines, we make airtime, we make like that comes first above all else. And I've worked in shops, for example, where um there was literally intentionally created, like, I believe the room started out as a lactation room for new moms, but what it was commonly known as was the crying room. Because there's no crying in the newsroom. Suck it up. We have a newscast to do. So you take your feelings and whatever that is, you go down to that room by yourself, you close the door, you boo-hoo it out, get it together, come back to the newsroom. This is where we work. That's been my experience. So the idea of being able to express to somebody some of these feelings, it's almost like there's resistance, as if it feels foreign. Like, but there's no feelings in news. There's facts. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is an uphill climb. In order to change the culture that you're talking about, it will take a massive move of people all behaving similarly. Like I am gonna share when the shit hits the fan. I
Mhm.
am gonna share when I am being torn apart because of the story. And if I don't share, then the culture never changes. Because if I can share, then somebody's going to get wind that you did it, right? That I did it, and then they're going to be like, if Sam can share, then I can share. Oh, but if Jenna can share, then I can share. Oh, but then I saw my manager share, then Dom's like, but I can share, right? Culture is what happens in the day-to-day behaviors of an organization. Culture is not this thing that's hard to put your finger on. You can like kind of talk about it, but you can't really see it. No, you can see it. You can see it when you go out on a traumatic story and you come back and nobody asks, how are you? That's a culture move. It's a behavior that contributes to a trauma ignoring culture, right? You come back from a story And you don't hear anything about the job that you did. All you know is that it brought in this many page views and that wasn't the right amount, right? Or you try to push back on a story and you get yelled at and kicked out of an office. These are behaviors that contribute to a culture that is not sustainable for journalists who are also people. We're also people.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering, like, where does, I guess, trust come into that? Because a lot of also what I'm hearing are things that I have to be able to trust that if I share with you this incredibly vulnerable thing, or that, I'm at my limit or something else like that, that that's not something that's going to be held against me. Like, oh, this, like, yeah, they're a good reporter, or yeah, they're a good, host, journalist, whatever, but they can't really handle the job because they're breaking down and we need somebody we can literally work like a workhorse.
Yeah, I mean that's listen, I've been there. I've been there, and establishing trust takes a long time. And for those folks who are coming from a place of, I've never trusted leadership in my newsroom before, but I want to be a journalist because I am a journalist, my number one recommendation is to figure out for yourself why there was not trust there, number one, and then draft questions that will help you understand when you land in a newsroom that has trust potential, right? So everything that has happened to you within a newsroom that has contributed to your trauma or vicarious trauma or burnout or compassion fatigue or despair, the list goes on. There are a multitude of things that are happening behavior-wise that when you hit your next interview, right, you should be leveraging your past to understand your potential present and future, right? Because how do I want to say this to you? I want to say to you that journalists are so good at being curious on behalf of a story and so not good at being curious for ourselves. And if we have been brought up to understand that interrogation is a superpower on behalf of community, then we ought to interrogate the next organization and the next leader and the next team that we will work for in order to find the team that will meet us where we are so that we know that there is trust. We know that there is psychological safety. We know that I can show up as who I am. But if you don't ask the questions, right, you're not going to get to the newsroom, to the team that's going to be able to show up for you the way that we all deserve to. And here's the thing, and you guys know this about me already, I've been in those newsrooms and I've been on those kinds of teams. I know that they exist. I have coached and taught leaders all over the world. The leaders that I have coached and that I have taught, these people exist, y'all. It'd be nice if we had more than one in a newsroom, especially at the local level, working on it, right? But do they exist? They do exist. And are they working hard? They're working hard, right? They're working hard to change that behavior so that down the line, the culture itself also changes. But yeah, I just, for any journalist that has been burned, but knows that through and through, they can't see themselves doing any other kind of work, how do you leverage what happened into questions that will get you the answers to know if the next interview is the job that you really want, is the job that you want, right?
Okay, this is why I have to ask this question because
Ask me, girl. I'm gonna have an answer. I don't know. Maybe
well, no, listen, this is so helpful to have this conversation. I really can't even emphasize that enough, but um it, I really try not to approach at least my life from a place of scarcity. But I cannot ignore the fact that at this moment, we are in a space where there are so many journalists right and left who just keep getting laid off, laid off. Dom and I were laid off. And really what triggered all of this for us was the effective shuttering of Vice News, an institution that I really respected the work that they did. Even the stuff that people thought was silly, I still thought it was daring and great. The point is, when there's so many people, because I've seen so many of these journalists, and also from like WAMU, I think, in DC, just so many of these outlets, and they're all talking about, I was laid off, but I still want to do this. So there's a limited number of jobs left, and yet all of these journalists who are, I don't know, I how does this climate not add to the trauma of this? Because not only is this something I feel called to do, but I'm not sure if I can safely do it. I mean, what if you have a family? What if you have, pets or people or other someone else who relies on you? Like it's become so unbelievably unstable. This thing that I feel called to do now suddenly feels incredibly scary to pursue.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I wrestle with this myself. I think the instability of the industry is one of the top hazards of being a journalist. We don't talk about the hazards of this work nearly enough. We all kind of wear superhero cloaks as if we're invincible to these things, but the instability of the industry, it contributes to the burnout. I think one of the things that I take heart in is that the industry is getting to a point, thank goodness, of welcoming people back. It's getting to a point of acknowledging that journalist only experience isn't the only experience needed for a newsroom to thrive, especially a newsroom that is truly community centered. These diverse perspectives and experiences critical to reading people outside of your status quo. And so if it is a calling for you, I wouldn't give it up. Though I would also bear in mind that a calling can also like take a break. Like a calling, it can take a break. And if you are in a position uh, to allow yourself some airtime to breathe and to figure some things out before you go back in, I would highly recommend that, right? Because maybe you want to go back in and you want to go back in a completely different role, for example. Or you want to go back in, but you haven't processed what's happened to you yet in order to leverage it to make sure it doesn't happen again, for example, right? Like there's a lot of processing that needs to happen, a lot of connecting. And as we've talked about, there is a lot of self-discovery, I think, necessary for any laid off journalist who wants to go back knowing that they are also more than a journalist this time around.
And I feel like that, at least for me, is going to be my big challenge. Who am I without that job title? Because they've been synonymous in my head for a long time.
Yeah.
And the same thing, and I know Jen and I are, although we were both laid off at the same time, for me, and she knows this, like part of the discovery for me of doing this podcast and working with her on this it's been using my voice in a different way as a producer sometimes, or people who work behind the scenes. Oftentimes, you watch your words and your guests and your stories that you've been working on, you watch somebody else go and report on them. And so it can be very different to now put yourself on that part of the story, whether or not you think you deserve to have that voice, or whether some of us don't, it's a skill that we're trying to get better at. Just because you start realizing, what else do I have to say, whether it is whatever field it develops into. And I know Jenna has really, it I know Jenna has really, as she said, like she's been dealing with, she wants to stay in. I've loved the work that I've done in journalism, even if I wasn't always crazy about every single story, but there are so many stories that I've covered that I never would have had that opportunity of, being able to tell, whether it was about queer homelessness or whether it was, I mean, there were stories to me, the ones that always stood out to me are the ones that we were able to really dig in and go with to the people, because sometimes, different newsrooms report differently. You're not always out in the field. And I know, Jenna, we've had a great time actually being in the field and being with the people, and that means a lot. Um, so I think discovering different parts of ourselves and this whole process has been, as you said, like if people are able to do it, I know for me, I kind of feel like it's important to do it at this point in my life. And I think for a lot of people, we see there aren't as many jobs and there is instability out there. It feels like this is an important time to actually do this because I don't I don't know if it's going to be the same as what it was years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. The industry's changing so much. And so therefore it feels like this is the time to kind of try and step out.
Yeah, I think we cover stories of individual and collective risk all the time. We love a good underdog story, we've seen those across our lives. And um, I mean, maybe we as journalists, we are the underdog,
Mm.
and stepping outside of a daily newsroom, whether we chose it or not, I think we can be okay with that risk and understand that there will be a reward. It may not be the one that we had originally envisioned, because maybe right now the only reward that we want is another job, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But again, I think that also continues to centralize the the identity of a journalist inside of us. When you're right, Dom, I think there are other pieces of us that have probably been neglected, forgotten completely, because of the name of the work and the nature of the work. And so yeah, I don't know. It's tough, right? I mean, like, can't you tell I'm a glass half full, like, kind of person?
We
So
like that
Yeah,
though.
no, we
That's
love
important.
that. Trust me, and that also feels for
I,
it.
I'm so hopeful. I don't
Yeah.
know. I'm so hopeful. I'm hopeful for how the industry is diversifying. I'm hopeful for the investment in the industry and for a variety of voices that are coming. And I am trying to be hopeful for like the business model case of it, right? Because I think there is always a risk in taking a journalist out of the newsroom to eventually run their own newsroom. And because they only saw the newsroom being run in one way, it's the way that they run it. And so you just repeat the mistakes of the past, right?
Hmm.
And so to me, that's like one of the biggest risks to where we are right now. Though I do imagine that with the way that the layoffs are hitting and people, we want to know it's in our circle of control. I imagine that there will be some really rad startups popping up out of this. And I think it's going to be very, very cool. And what I hope is that for anyone who is going to take on that work, that has come from the editorial side of the shop, that they would be very open to really understanding the business side of this work. Because if you continue to keep the two separate, it will be really, really hard to have, you know, a startup that's financially viable, I think.
Well, I did have one more question, sort of related to the layoffs, and that was for the people left behind, for lack of a better description. Like, um, for the people who still have their jobs, but they've just watched, like, I don't know, a whole room, like 10, 20, 30, a whole department of their colleagues just get wiped out. Doesn't that also have some sort of detrimental, like, just effect on them in terms of that's a different kind of trauma?
Oh, sure. Sure, absolutely. I mean, so that goes back to this idea of direct versus indirect, right? And so it didn't happen to me, but I saw it happen. And so there's like this indirect exposure to this workplace hazard or workplace trauma. And for the people who are left behind, um, there's concern there, right? Whether it's going to be them next, or how do I take on more work when I've been at capacity for years, right? Do I even want to continue to do more of that? Some people will, freeze and they'll bury their head in the sand, and maybe they'll get forgotten and left, maybe they'll just like get passed by, right? I think for the people who are left behind, I go back to my own newsroom experience and running a really large team. And the goal was always that they would be hireable. And it sucked, right? Like it sucked for them to constantly be learning new things. They were like, Sam, this is like enough. Can you relax? And I'm like, no, I cannot relax. Do you not see what's happening in the industry? I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to tell you that. We need to know newsletter strategy. We need to do this. We need to be the first team on the new CMS. This is the reason why, right? But like, I needed it for them. And I am grateful that they trusted me, that I knew what I was doing. Because what I never wanted was for them to end up in that situation and then feel like they had no place else to go, to feel that their skills were antiquated. And so how are you ensuring that you are as hireable as possible? Yes, this is a part of your manager's role, but depending on the type of manager you report to, it may be 100% on you. And there are lots of resources. There are lots of ways to get coaching and conferences or sessions to attend, whatever the case is, right? But how are you ensuring that you are hireable kind of going forward? What is missing from your resume? And then I think too, is it time for you? Is always a question. And for me, it comes down to, am I making an emotional decision because of what has just happened to my colleagues? Or am I looking across the facts and some of the threads to know, for me, Sam, you have given all you've got, right? And you have tried to stay doing X, Y, and Z. Now it is time for you to exit. And then you kind of start to create this exit plan for yourself, right? Which may be 6 months, it may be a year, it may be 18 months, fine. But to me, it's incredibly empowering to know that you can do that for yourself, right? Though I understand, let me also say, that trying to work a job when half of your team was just laid off, while also thinking about your future and like maybe like trying to put 20 years of experience into a resume because you haven't applied for a job since then. It's a tall order. It comes out of my mouth way easier than it actually is to execute. And so do not throw tomatoes at the screen. I understand that what we're talking about is not always easy.
Hey, everyone. So we're going to stop the conversation with Sam there right now, and we'll be picking up the rest of our combo with her next week, where we'll be diving in a little deeper in terms of the topics of burnout, what it is, what it isn't actually, and also the issue of moral injury, which is a really interesting topic. So we'll have more of that next week. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you might notice that Jen and I have changed clothes. Basically, being full transparency, we realized after we taped the conversation with Sam, we did a tag out, close, finishing off the episode, doing a check-in with each other, and we realized, oh, wait a minute, we didn't transition well out of this. So we just decided to on Friday morning, we just said, let's do this again and try and do a new tag out. So that's why you might have noticed that we're dressed in different clothes. It's not your imagination. Right, Jenna?
Exactly. And I'm also almost through my COVID, so I feel so much better.
Yay.
But anyway, as always, thanks again, you guys. And yeah, like and follow, share, leave a comment, and we'll see you next week. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Domenic and Jenna Flanagan. Music provided by Jay Cowett. Research by Lori Rothenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at layoffandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.